Hi. So we're going to finish up with Pirkei Avot, chapter 4 today. We're in Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers, chapter 4. We're up to Mishnah 24. If you have a Siddur, we're on page 251. And any copy of Pirkei Avot will be fine. Chapter 4, Mishnah 24. So we begin this way. Shmuel HaKatan Omer. Shmuel HaKatan. Katan in Hebrew means small, little. So here's a guy whose name is Sam Little. Exactly why did he get this nickname, Hakatan? Nobody really knows. Some people think that, the obvious answer is that he was a short guy and everybody went around and calling him Little Sam. Maybe he was a huge guy and as a kind of a joke, everybody called him Little Sam. We don't know any of that. The only thing that tradition seems to say about Shmuel HaKatan is that Katan, little, seems to refer to his humility. There's one story they tell us about him where a certain number of people, and only that number of people, were summoned or invited to come to a very special meeting, and one more person came who wasn't really invited. And the leader of the group said, hey, what's going on here? Whoever wasn't invited, out. And Shmuel HaKatan, who did have an invitation in his pocket, but his nature was, you know what, I don't want anybody else to be embarrassed. I'm going to say it was me. So that gives us perhaps a hint of his personality. His significance in Jewish history, besides being one of the rabbis, besides what we learn about him here, is that when they were putting together the Amidah, there was the need to add an additional paragraph. And it's called concerning the minim. Minim were sectarians, heretics, probably refers to the earliest Jews who accepted Jesus. And after the death of Jesus, a number of Jews said, he's the guy, he was the Messiah. We're still Jewish, but we believe that the Messiah has come. And the Jewish community was not too pleased about that and looked for ways to try to separate itself from those Jewish Christians, those sectarians who went beyond what was acceptable in the Jewish world. And so he's the one who puts together the paragraph in the Amidah, Lamalshinim al tihi tikva, right? Which originally began speaking only about sectarians. Later, when Christianity becomes the state religion of Rome, a couple of hundred years later, you couldn't say that anymore. And so it switched from being specifically against the Jewish Christians, now was more about anyone who was a traitor, anyone who turned against his people, and indeed against all evil people as well. Okay, so what does Shmuel HaKatan say? By the way, notice that he's one of the few people who's quoted in Pirkei Avot who isn't a rabbi. It's not Rabbi Shmuel, it's Shmuel HaKatan. Samuel, the little one, says, Bin pol oivecha al tismach. In the fall of your enemy, do not rejoice. Uvikashlo al yagel libcha. And when he fails, when he stumbles, don't let your heart rejoice. Pen yireh Adonai v'ra b'einav. Lest God see this and it be evil in God's eyes, v'heshiv me'alav apo, and he will divert his God's wrath from the enemy to you. So what's interesting about this teaching is that it's not at all original. Shmuel HaKatan is simply quoting two sentences from the book of Proverbs. Proverbs is an entire book of wisdom, of couplets, of aphorisms. And here he's simply quoting Proverbs chapter 24, lines 17 and 18. Doesn't even quote it and then bring his own kind of interpretation or commentary. He simply quotes it. So why would he do this? And why would the editor put him in? So look, one possibility is that over the course of time, we've lost maybe something else from this Mishnah, and all that remained was this quote. Or that Shmuel HaKatan was known throughout his life for this teaching, this biblical phrase, which he was always quoting and always using. And maybe, he became so connected and attached to this phrase that when they put him in to Pirkei Avot, it was just his quote and nothing else that he had to say. So here's an interesting thought. All of the Pirkei Avot were dealing, for the most part, with between the destruction of the temple in the year 70 and then the defeat of Bar Kokhba in the Second Great Rebellion in the year 135. So my guess is that although things didn't work out well for the Jews in either case, there were probably times when there were some victories that were celebrated. And perhaps Shmuel HaKatan is referring to things that were happening around him in his own day when he's saying you need to learn how to be a good winner. Today, we always mention in our culture, in our society, you need to be a good loser. If you lose, you need to suck it up and not to take it out on the umpire or the other team, or to break your bat, or all other kinds of things like that. But in addition to being a good loser, Shmuel HaKatan seems to be saying you need to be a good winner. And it's interesting if you consider the history, for instance, World War I. Most historians would tell us that the reason that we had World War II is because of the way that Germany was treated after their defeat in World War I. Had the other nations, the League of Nations, the Allies, been more magnanimous or more intelligent and not so punitive, that perhaps it would have, that American history, world history would have turned out differently. Perhaps you can make the case that we learned that lesson. So following World War II, certainly with Japan and even with Germany, with West Germany, we know that they ultimately were welcomed back into the Council of Nations, and things were not too punitive that would ultimately lead them to reach out and try to get revenge and destroy. So we can understand what Shmuel HaKatan is teaching us here from the point of view of good strategy, as well as from a moral point of view. You don't want to rub, your enemy's face in the dirt if you best him, because ultimately he's just going to come back at you. And here, interestingly, the proverb doesn't say you better be careful because your enemy will be upset. Here, Shmuel HaKatan quotes the teaching which says, you better be careful because God will be upset. If God sees you gloating, then you're going to bring bad things on yourself from God, not just from your enemy. So we move on, Mishnah 25, Kaf He. Elisha ben Avuya Omer. So here we have one of the most fascinating, interesting, incredible figures in Jewish, certainly in rabbinic history. Elisha ben Avuya, notice he's not a rabbi. He was almost stripped of that title because of what happened. He was one of the students in the circle of Rabbi Akiba, and ultimately there's a story about how he lost his faith and ultimately turned against Judaism and the Jewish people. So what happened? We're told that once he saw a father and a son, and the father says to the son, look up in that tree, you see there's a nest, mother bird is sitting on the eggs. Here's what I want you to do. Climb up the tree, shoo away the bird, and bring down the eggs for us. And Elisha ben Avuya is watching this and he's saying, isn't this incredible? Of the 613 commandments in the Torah, there are only 2 in which it actually tells you what your reward will be. One of them is if you obey your parents, and the reward will be a long and healthy life. The second one is when you go to take eggs from a nest, if you shoo away the mother bird so that she doesn't have to see her babies, the eggs being taken from her. And if you do that, the punishment will also be a long and wonderful life. So as Elisha ben Avuya overhears the father and sees the son climbing up the tree, he said, boy, do I envy that kid, fulfilling the 2 commandments that promise long, long life. What happens? The boy goes up the tree, he shoos away the mother bird, he takes the eggs, and on his way down, his foot slips, he falls out of the tree, he breaks his neck, and he dies. Elisha ben Avuya can't understand this. How could this be? The Torah specifically promised, if you listen to your father and if you shoo away the mother bird, you will live a long and wonderful life. This kid did both mitzvot and he died. At that point, Elisha ben Avuya says the Torah is a lie. There's nothing here that I believe anymore. Not only did he leave the Jewish religion, he becomes a collaborator with the Romans, and he turns in some of the rabbis and other Jews that the Romans were looking after. From the point of view of the rabbis and the Jewish people, Elisha ben Avuya was a traitor. And he was no longer referred to by a title, wasn't even referred to by his name. Instead, Elisha ben Avuya is often referred to as Acher, which means that guy. They didn't even like to say his name. So that's the lesson that we learned. By the way, there's an interesting epilogue to that. Turns out that Elisha ben Avuya had a great student who was to become Rabbi Meir. And people said, Rabbi Meir, your main teacher was Elisha ben Avuya. He's suspect. You have to be suspect. He must have taught you a lot of things, and you are the beneficiary of his wisdom, and yet, he's no good. Maybe you're no good. And Elisha ben Avuya said a very famous parable. He said, you know what? I found a pomegranate, the rind, the outer part of the pomegranate I discarded, and only the seeds that I keep. In other words, yes, I learned from him, but whatever bad things he had to say, I didn't pay attention. I discarded them. His good elements, the seeds within the pomegranate, that's what I kept. So what is, and by the way, it's an incredible thing that Elisha ben Abuya, despite, his history, nevertheless, he still made it into Pirkei Avot, and we still learn from him. Maybe following the example of Meir, you keep the good, you throw away the bad. Elisha ben Abuya Omer, Halomed Yeled, one who learns as a child. Lema hu domeh, what is he similar to? L'dio ketuva al niyar chadash, to ink that is written on a new piece of parchment. You got to remember that in those days, you couldn't go to Staples and pick up, 1,000 pieces of paper to write on. Paper didn't exist, more or less. People wrote either on reed paper, papyrus, but you needed to be near Egypt to get the reeds or other places, or they used parchment, which comes from animal hides. As you can imagine, that's very expensive. We throw out paper without even thinking about it. In those days, people couldn't throw away papyrus or parchment so quickly. So often what happened is people would write on a piece of parchment, and then when they no longer needed that, they would try to erase it, scrape it clear, and then they'd use it again. Now, as you can imagine, scraping ink off of parchment and then using it again and again and again ultimately left you with a rather dark and difficult to read piece of paper, parchment, to write on. So Rabbi Elisha says, if you learn as a kid, you're like a new piece of parchment. You're clean, you're fresh, whatever is written sticks, it looks nice, it's beautiful, it will stay. But v'halomed zakein. But if you learn when you're an older person, l'mahu domeh, what are you like? L'dio, like ink that is ketuvah, written al niyar machuk, on paper that has been blotted or erased or scraped away. So, we have, you may be aware, there's something called a palimpsest, that there are sometimes, and especially not so much today, but from the medieval world, people would do this all the time. And there were levels. Sometimes you would scrape things right on top of it, and you'd be able to see not only what you just wrote now, you'd be able to see the ghost of what was written on the page beforehand. And you have that kind of interesting mixture. We find the same thing with some of the great artworks from the Middle Ages. Somebody drew something and then somebody else comes, and to get canvas wasn't always so easy, so you'd paint on top of it. And now, with our technology today, we're able to uncover what was originally underneath what we see on the outside today. So we have that notion. One of the interesting things, I think, is we have the whole idea of learning languages. Most people understand that when you're a kid, you can learn a language so easily. In fact, kids who are 2 or 3 or 4 sometimes are able to pick up multiple languages. And it seems so easily. And then if you're 40 years old and you decide you want to learn Spanish or French, it is so difficult for most people when they get older. Our brains don't work the same way. So maybe that's what Elisha ben Abuya is talking about. I wondered if maybe there's a different explanation. It seems, the obvious thing is that writing on this palimpsest, one on top of the other, is not a good thing. You don't get clear writing, you get dirty, you get dark look. But maybe there is a good element. Maybe ultimately that writing on top of something else, we get layers, we have background, we have experience. So I'm wondering maybe you could look at this Mishnah in that way as well. By the way, there's another interpretation. It says, Halomed Yeled. And almost everybody interprets this to mean when you learn when you are a child. But maybe it means when you teach to a child. Halomed Yeled. Hamilamed Yeled. One who teaches a child. What is he like? Right? It's like you're writing on fresh paper. But if you teach somebody who's older, maybe that's better than teaching the child. Child doesn't have worldly experience. He doesn't have anything to compare it to. He doesn't really know what you're talking about. Maybe he'll memorize things. If you teach somebody who's older, think about, an 18-year-old who sits in a college class and doesn't want to be there, just needs the credit, as opposed to somebody in their 40s or 50s or 60s who goes back for adult education courses in a university, and is so serious and is able to deal with life experience. You read literature and you can say, I lived through this, whereas an 18-year-old doesn't. So that's another way to look at this. Let's look at Mishnah 26 in a similar way. If 25 is talking about when's the best time to learn, when you're young or when you're old, Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda, we don't know anything about him. This is his only time he shows up. Yossi Bar Yehuda says, we know that he was from Kfar Bahabavli, the Babylonian village. Where that is, nobody knows. Halomed min haketanim, one who learns from the young. Lamahu domeh, what is he similar to? Li ochel anavim kehot. It's like somebody who eats unripe grapes, v'shoteh yayin migito, and who has drinking wine that just came out of the wine press. It's not very good wine. The grapes are still sour. V'halomed min hazkenim. But if you learn from elders, l'mahu domeh, what is he similar to? Liochel anavim b'shulot. It's similar to somebody who is eating ripe grapes, v'shoteh yayin yashan, and he is drinking wine, the best wine that has aged. 2019 was a very good year for Manischewitz, but not for any other real good wines. So if you talk about, I got the Chateau Rothschild from 1847. That was a good bottle of wine, right? The idea is that wine ages and it gets better. So here we have the notion of not when is a good time to learn, young or old, but from whom is it best to learn from. So think about it. You go to college, you're paying a lot of money in tuition, and you're sitting in a class with 300 other people, and maybe you have a teaching assistant who is giving the lecture, right? As opposed to you're in the professor's class who's got tenure, who's been around, who's published, who knows how to teach, and maybe there aren't 300 people in the class. Maybe it's a seminar, and there's 10 people sitting around the table. So clearly, I think we understand that, you'd rather learn from the experienced person than from the new kid who's just trying to figure out how this whole teaching thing works. On the other hand, you could make the case that sometimes that distinguished professor with tenure who's written all the books, does he really care about the students sitting in his class? What he cares about is he's working on his next book. He's dealing with research, right? And the price for him to be able to have a place in the university and the paycheck is that he's got to put up with a couple of classes. But he has only disdain for these young students who can't begin to understand the serious work that he himself is doing. On the other hand, if you had the TA, teaching assistant, who gets exactly where the kids are coming from, maybe he can relate to them, and he doesn't have disdain for them, maybe that's the better way. So, fascinating philosophical question. When's the best time to learn? And who's the best person to learn from? The tradition would say, learn when you're young from an experienced teacher. But life isn't always that black and white and that simple. So we then go on to Mishnah 27, Rabbi Omer. Now, here this says rabbi taught. There's only one rabbi who was known as rabbi. Everybody else, it's Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yossi, but there's only one guy who is Rabbi, the rabbi, and that is Yehuda Hanasi, Judah the patriarch, or Judah the prince, or Judah Hanasi, he's sometimes referred to. And by the way, he is the ultimate editor of Pirkei Avot, because he's the one who's credited with editing the Mishnah, all 63 tractates, putting them in a form that they ultimately would be written down and would be published. So here, he puts himself in, we've seen him before, but he comes back and he's got something else he wants to tell us. Rabbi Omer, al tistakel bakankan. Don't look at the bottle or at the cask. Ella b'masha yesh bo, but rather pay attention to what's in it, right? This, of course, would be the equivalent of don't judge a book by its cover. We use the metaphor of books. He used the metaphor of wine, of casks, or of bottles, okay? And maybe what's happening here is that he inserted this comment as a commentary to what we just saw. Learn when you're young from an older teacher. And Rabbi maybe is coming along to say, don't judge the wine by the bottle, okay? Because he then says, Yesh kankan chadash, you might have a new cask or a new bottle, malei yashan, that has inside of it old wine, meaning good wine. The yashan, and you might see an old bottle, shafilu chadash ein bo, that doesn't have anything in it. So don't pick the wine based on what the bottle looks like or what the cask. Don't make assumptions. Now, I don't think that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi is giving us advice about how to buy a bottle of wine. I think what he's perhaps telling us is, remember what those two guys before me just said? Don't be so quick to judge. You know, we don't, an older student, you're never going to get it. Or you don't want to learn from a TA, there's nothing there. You know, only go for the best, the oldest, the most experienced. Maybe, maybe not. And maybe Rabbi simply put himself in here in parentheses and saying, I don't know about these other two guys. I got to put them in. They're important people. They have an important idea for us to think about. Let me tell you what I think about. Don't judge the book by its cover. We then go on and we read the following. Mishnah Kavchet, Mishnah 28. Rabbi Elazar HaKapar Omer. Elazar HaKapar, we don't really know what the word kapar means. Some people think that it might be an occupation. Maybe it's similar to a sandlar, a sandal maker, a shoemaker, or somebody who worked in leather. We don't really know. But Rabbi Elazar HaKapar Omer, Hakina, which is envy, V'hata'ava, and lust, V'hakavod, and honor, meaning pursuit of honor, Motzi'in et ha'adam min ha'olam, that those three things will get you knocked out of the world. So you got to remember, way back in chapter 2 of Pirkei Avot, Mishnah 16, we already saw that there were three things that'll get you kicked out of this world. One was ayin hara, selfishness, the evil eye. One was yetzer hara. And again, if yetzer, some people would say yetzer hara is selfishness. Ayin hara is being greedy, niggardliness, not wanting to share, not wanting to give somebody else. And the third one is sinat habriot, hating general people in general, right? So back there, chapter 2, we saw three things will get you kicked out of the world. You think only about yourself. You're not willing to share with others. You hate other people. We can certainly imagine that under those circumstances, people are going to turn against you, hate you, and they're going to exclude you either literally or metaphorically from the community, from their lives. We also saw in chapter 3, Mishnah 14, that there was a second teaching about three things that'll get you kicked out of the world. First one was Shena Shel Shacharit, sleeping late. Okay. Second one was Yain Shel Tzoharayim, drinking in the afternoon. Right. The idea was that alcoholic consumption was something that should happen at dinner and after, not in the middle of the day. And then the third one was Sichat Yiladim, either childish prattle or speaking, spending your time talking with little kids. And then in that Mishnah, we saw a fourth thing that'll get you kicked out, Yeshivat Beit Knesiot Shel Amei Haaretz, hanging around in assemblies of an Am Haaretz, of the ignorant, of people who don't know too much, don't care about things seriously, right? So we had these two previous teachings which speak about the three or the four things that will kill you, that will get you kicked out of the world. Now we see a third teaching with the same ending, but with a different beginning. And now, in this case, Elazar HaKapar says, you know what the three things are that'll get you, kicked out, voted off the island? They are jealousy, lust, and the pursuit of honor. So jealousy, we certainly, understand that. If all you care about is what somebody else has, and that becomes your obsession, all you can think about, then you've got no real life. And it may be that in your pursuit of getting precisely the things that you are envious of other people for, ultimately you might do something stupid that could get you killed. You could actually lose your life. And by the way, the example that some of the commentaries bring for that, for jealousy and losing your life, is the story of Korach. Korach was a cousin of Moses from the tribe of the Levites. And Korach, in the book of Numbers, we'll read about it in a couple of weeks from now in the Torah reading. Korach says, why should that guy be the head of all the people? I'm from the same tribe. It should have been me. And ultimately, he tries to undermine Moses. He tries to lead a rebellion against Moses. And of course, in the well-known biblical story, what happens, the earth opens up and Korach is literally swallowed up by the earth. And so there, the traditional commentaries tell us there's a guy who was jealous of his cousin. He wanted to be the leader, and look what it got him. So the second one is that'll get you kicked out of the world is ta'ava, lust. Ta'ava could be all kinds of lust. It could be lust for food. It could be lust for sex or anything else that we desire, right? And that ultimately becomes our undoing. The rabbis have an incredible proverb that speaks to this. They say, when it comes to ta'ava, when it comes to lust of all kind, if you starve it, it will be satisfied. If you feed it, it will be starved. Okay, once again, one of the things that rabbis do is they bring these internal contradictions, which initially we say, wait, what are you talking about? It can't be, it's impossible. But by drawing our attention, it becomes a very important teaching tool. So lust, be it for food or for sex, if you starve it, if you control it, it ultimately will be satisfied. Okay? They're not saying to give it up completely. They're saying control it. And on the other hand, if you feed it, right, the more you have, the more you want. You're never satisfied. Therefore, you need to control your appetites, whatever they be, unless they will ultimately destroy you. If we're talking about food, you eat the wrong things and too much of them, physically that can kill you. If it's all about sex, and we certainly understand that somebody who pursues this, maybe even sleeping with somebody else's wife, that can ultimately get you killed, right? Let alone the whole issue of diseases and things like that. So that's the second thing that you need to be wary of. And then the third one is kavod, is honor. You got to be careful about honor, because people who pursue it, who want attention, who want everybody to know about them, who want everybody to applaud them, right? That can ultimately get you kicked out of the world. What are you willing to do to be appreciated, to be honored? Sometimes you're going to do things that are going to get you in big trouble. And the rabbis tell an interesting story. David's son was Solomon. Solomon's son was Rehavam in Hebrew. And whereas Solomon was the smartest of all the kings, we're told that his son was perhaps the stupidest. And people came to Rehoboam and said, your father imposed all these taxes on us, and he sent us off to become laborers. We had to build a temple. We had to build a palace. We had to build ports. We had to build stables, right, for Solomon. Okay, for Solomon, we were willing to do it. He was the greatest, the smartest of all kings. But you, his son, Rehoboam, you're a young kid, you got to ease up on us. So Rehoboam went to his father's advisors And he said to them, what do you think I ought to do about this? And his father's advisors said, almost to the sense of, starve it and it is satisfied, feed it and it is starved. His father's advisor said, you know what, give it a little bit, get them on your side, they'll eventually come along. But he said, okay, thank you. He went to his friends, his young friends, and he said, what do you think I ought to do? And they said, you're the king. Nobody tells you what to do. You let them know who the boss is. So Rehoboam stupidly listened to his friends, went to the delegates from Israel and said, you thought my father was bad? Wait till you see what I'm going to do to you. Well, people weren't going to take it from Rehoboam. And in fact, there was a major split in the nation. There were originally 12 tribes, and the king came from the tribe of Judah in the south, and the tribe of Shimon was a smaller tribe nearby. But there were 10 tribes in the north. And when Rehoboam said this to the 10 tribes, you thought my father was bad? Wait till you see what I'm going to do to you. They said, that's it. We're out of here. We've had it. And they followed the leader of a rebel whose name was Jeroboam, Jeroboam. And ultimately, there was a civil war. There was a secession. And the 10 tribes in the north, Israel, that's what they became known as, Yisrael, the country of Israel. They split from the 2 tribes in the south who were known as Yehudah, as Judah. And from approximately 900 down to approximately 700 for the BCE, for the next 200 years, we have 2 countries who are split. Sometimes they dealt with each other, sometimes they were at war with one another. And it's ultimately because the nation was split that in 722 BCE, the Assyrians coming down from the north were able to attack the 10 tribes in the north, carry them away, and hence were never heard of again. So that's where we get the 10 lost tribes. Judah was left alone at that moment, but around the year 586 BCE, Judah will be defeated and destroyed, not by the Assyrians, but by their successors, the Babylonians. So at any rate, according to rabbinic midrash, God goes to Jeroboam at this critical moment in history when he's going to take 10 of the tribes away and lead this rebellion. And God says to him, listen, I'll make you a promise. You stay with the people, and I promise you that one day in the future, you and David, the great King David, you and David will walk together into my presence. You will both come into heaven. So Jeroboam says, who's going to go first, me or David? And God says, well, we're talking about King David. I mean, after all, he wrote all the Psalms. He conquered Jerusalem. He killed Goliath. David goes first. You go right behind him. And Jeroboam says, if I ain't first, forget about it. Right? And at that point, leads the rebellion, takes the 10 tribes away. And again, this notion of, because he pursued honor, his own honor, it was all about him. I have to be first before King David, we're told, look what happened to the Jewish people. And you should know that in not only biblical, but in rabbinic literature, Jeroboam, because he does this, because he splits the kingdom, and because in the north he sets up 2 alternate temples, right? He's considered a great idolater and is considered one of the real bad guys of Jewish history. So that's the story of that Mishnah. So now we come to the final Mishnah number 29. Hu haya omer, he also said, so we're continuing with Elazar ha-Kapar. And here it's almost like we're listening to the beginning, when Law and Order starts. Our criminal justice system is divided into two parts, the police and the courts. So you see a very similar idea here. He says, Hayilodim lamut. All people who are born, they're all going to die. Vahametim lahachayot. But all the dead will ultimately be resurrected. They will rise and live again. Vahachayim, but all those who are alive, lidom. Eventually, when the dead come back to life and you're alive again, you will have to appear before God in a court of law. Leida, ulahodia, ulahivada. We have three verbs here. To stand in judgment, to make it known, and have it acknowledged. Shehu el. You will have to acknowledge that God is indeed the God. And what do you need to know about God? Hu hayotzer. He's the one who fashioned us, designed us. Hu haborei. He is the creator. Hu hamevin. He is the one who understands, who discerns all things. Hu dayan. He is the judge. Hu aid. God. He is the witness. Hu bal hadin. He is the one with the complaint. In other words, in contemporary English, we would say judge, jury, and executioner. This is the rabbinic way of saying the very same thing. Remember, in those days, they didn't have jury trials. You appeared before the judge, and the judge was the one who decided on your innocence or guilt. So when you appear, after you are resurrected from the dead, and you appear before God, God is everything. He knows everything. And he's judge, jury, and executioner. V'hu atid ladun. He will be the one who will hand out judgment. She'ein lefanav lo avla v'lo shichacha. There is no sin in this judge, right? There is no forgetting. This judge knows all. This judge can't be bribed. Lo maso panim. This judge won't say, "Oh, you're my friend. I'm going to give you a pass on this one." V'lo mikach shochad. You can't bribe this judge. Shahakol shelo. Everything in the world, you think you're going to bring a bribe before God? Everything is God's. He doesn't need your gold. V'da, and no, shahakol l'fia cheshbon. And how does this judge work? It's all written down in the book, and it's all by the numbers. How many good deeds you did, how many sins you did, what kind of sins they were, what kind of weight they carry. V'al yavtichacha yitzrach, and don't, you should make sure that don't trust in yourself that you can get away with it. Shahasha'ol beit manosla. You don't think that you can hide from judgment. Sha'al karchach, and you need to know the following truth. Against your will, you were created. I didn't ask to be born. Well, tough. You're born, and it comes with responsibility, whether you like it or not. V'al karchach, and against your will, ata nolad, you are born into this world. V'al karchach, and against your will, ata chai, you're alive. V'al karchach, and against your will, ata meit, and you died, and you have no control where, when, how, why. V'al karchach, and against your will, ata atid, in the future you will give, litain, din v'cheshbon, a judgment, an accounting, lifnei melech malchei hamlachim, before the King of all kings, Hakadosh Baruch Hu. the Holy One, blessed is he. So with that, we come to the end of Perek Daled, chapter 4, and next week we will pick up with Pirkei, chapter 5.